says, if you are a believer, if you have experienced, illustrate his relationship between himself and the church by a pure relationship between the husband and a wife. It was to serve as an example, as a picture of what kind of a relationship Christ has with his church. And that is why he created marriage, so that it would be in the world a real life illustration of what his relationship to the church is. And so that is why God created it. And that's why he says again, who is a husband? Deep question, right? Who is a husband? What?
Jesus Christ.
No, this is not the Bible question. Simple. English question. I know, if a preacher is asking a question, Sunday school teacher, if it sounds good, it is God. If it sounds bad, it is devil. It's not that kind of question. Who is a husband? One that has a wife. Right? What is the implication of the word husband? It means he has a wife. And what is the implication that someone is a wife? That means what? She has a husband. That's as simple as that. So let's not complicate it. Right? And so, here Paul says, husbands, what? Love your wives. It is a command. So here he says, when a husband is filled with the Spirit of God, what happens? First of all, a husband will what do? Love his wife. Again, ladies, please don't misunderstand this. When he says as soon as husband love your wives means what does it mean for, the world interprets the word love differently. Right? What does love mean in the worldly sense? Kawas in konipetala? Tinalankunadi? Konipetala? Right? That's how the world defines it, right? Say, my husband loves me so much. What does he do? He buys me whatever I want. He cooks me whatever I want. He takes me wherever I want. That's kind of how the world defines love, right? That's why Valentine's Day is so popular. But that's not what the Bible talks about. When he says what? Husbands, love your wives. What is the next line? Just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So the first type of love he talks about is sacrificial love. The first type of love he's talking about is what? Sacrificial love. Interestingly, in all this passage from 25 to verse 30, you never see the word happiness. Again, I want us to focus on that. Why? Because when God gives us husband and wife relationships, he is more focused on how we bring holiness into each other's lives. It is not about why. Because our happiness, our gladness is not found in the human relationship, but rather in God who provides it to us. And so when we see marriage as a gift from God for our sanctification and for his glory, all the things that happen in a marriage. It seems there was one guy who always wore his wedding ring on his middle finger. And somebody looked at him and said, "Sir, you got your ring on the wrong finger." And he said, "Yes, because I married the wrong woman." It sounds funny, but that person forgot to realize that God put that particular person in his life for his own sanctification. So the first kind of love the Bible talks about is what? When you are filled with the Spirit of God, it is sacrificing love. Sacrificing what? He says, as Christ gave himself up for her in order to make her more like Christ. In order to make her more like Christ. That's the purpose of the sacrifice. Not sacrificing Christ for the things of the world. Right? Because what happens, especially in the American culture, what do they say? If mama ain't happy, have you heard that before? I guess you guys work all with Indians, so you don't hear these things, right? What does that say? Did you hear? Have you ever heard that before? It says if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Right? If mom is not happy at home, what happens? Right? She will make sure nobody's happy in the house. Why? Because mom, the wives have the ability to be either the thermometer or the thermostat. Right? What does the thermometer do? It just measures the temperature. It tells you the temperature is 75 degrees. What does the thermostat do? It sets the temperature. Right? So, husbands, your job is to love your wives sacrificially. That means what? To make the sacrifices needed to push her to be more like Christ. That means what? You may have to sacrifice your hobby. You may have to sacrifice sometimes what you do for your work. You may have to sacrifice some things in the world. Why? Because God has put her in your hands so that you would work to make her like. So the first thing he says, sometimes we won't like what our wives try to teach us, right? Men? God has put them also in our lives for our sanctification. We'll get to the next one. But sometimes when they teach us lessons, we won't like it. Just like when we want to push them to Christ, they may not like it. But what is our responsibility before the Lord? To sacrificially love them in order that they are growing in their holiness. Husbands are called to love them sacrificially. Then see verse 26. So that he who Christ might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. So, and then verse 27, so that he, that is Christ, might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing. And then what does he say? But that she would be what? Holy and blameless. So it is not only a sacrificial love. Secondly, Paul says, husbands, love your wives with a sanctifying love. Your love not only has to be sacrificial, it has to be sanctifying. Interestingly, Paul talks about what? No spot or wrinkle. Right? What are those two speak of? Age? Why do you say age? Wrinkles come with age, right? Yeah, somebody told me, I think, it's costly and painful to be beautiful. That's the mantra for ladies, right? It's costly and painful, right? But what does he say? Having no spot or wrinkle. But that's not the point here. What does he say? Spot speaks of external decay. Wrinkle speaks about internal decay. When do you get a wrinkle on your skin? Is when the muscle underneath becomes weaker, the skin begins to wrinkle. So spot speaks about external decay, wrinkle speaks about internal. And so what Paul is talking about is the husband has to love his wife in a sanctifying way so that any impurity that comes to her because of her own sinfulness, whether it is external or internal, is dealt with so that she would be holy and blameless before the Lord. So husband, you're supposed to love your wife in a sacrificial way. That means it's going to cost you something in order to push her towards holiness. Secondly, it has to be sanctifying love. It has to make her more like Christ. And that's the goal, Paul says. But not only that, see verse 28. Verse 28. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. So thirdly, he says it has to be sensitive love. Sacrificial, sanctifying, and sensitive love. Why is that? Because here, if you see, go to 1 Peter chapter 3. Go to 1 Peter chapter 3. First Peter chapter 3. Okay, you what did I say so far? What are the three things? What is that?
Both men and woman are created equal before God.
Okay, that's number one. That was about 20 minutes ago. What did I say since then? What? Jesse? Sacrificing love? Sanctifying Jessica? Sensitive. Okay, pay attention. So here he says, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 7, you husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone what? Weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Paul talks about, again, guys, we cannot think that we are somehow strong. He says what? As with someone weaker. That means what? You are also weak. Relatively, she is weaker. Because God has made her that way. It is God's creative design in order that the family would function in God's way. So he says here, a husband has to love his wife as he loves his own body. Why? You know? Because no one hates their own body. Right? Otherwise, majority of the businesses would go out of business. Because 90% of the things in the world are what? To make us different, look different, right? Feel different, feel good, all this stuff that the world throws at us. But here he says, your husband's love has to be what? Sensitive. So go back to Ephesians chapter 5. Again, we can spend a lot of time in every one of these, we just don't have the time. So Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians 5. See 29 and 30. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. He says, fourthly, it has to be a satisfying love. Husband have to love what? Nourish and cherish. Means what? He says what in the 1 Peter 3, he says, you are heirs together of the grace of life. That God is the one that brought your spouse to you for whatever period of time He chooses to put them in your life, in order that you would be more like Christ. You know, there's always this temptation in the world. Right? You know, I love this saying. Because somebody said, right? The grass is always where? Greener on the where? Other side. So one of the things we have to always be careful about, especially those that have been married, and husbands and wives, always be careful about comparing yourself to somebody else. Because God has specifically, uniquely designed your spouse for you, because God knows how He made you. Right? As somebody said, you know why the grass is greener on the other side? They said one of two reasons. Either there is more manure on that side, or it is fake. Because God specifically designed it. He says what? Your love has to be a satisfying love, nourishing and cherishing. And what happens is, discontent, bitterness grows in the soil of discontentment. When you begin to think, God, somehow that is better, or I deserve something better, then you begin to feed the discontent in your heart, and that discontent ultimately fights against God's purpose. God knew exactly when He made you, how He made you, the background you came from, the family you grew up in, everything God knew, and exactly made your spouse, your wife, exactly the way He wanted you to. For what? For her sanctification and yours. And when we come to realize that, only then we begin to see God's work, a hand at work in each of our lives. And then see what He says. Verse 33, Ephesians 5. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. And then finally he says his love has to be specific. His love has to be specific. Interestingly, in verse 22, he says what? Wives, be subject to whom? To your own husbands. And then in verse 33, he says, nevertheless, each individual is to love his own wife. It is a one-to-one relationship that God has ordained. It has to be a specific love for one individual. That's exactly God's plan. And so as Paul begins to delve into these family relationships, right? Again, what does the world say? And sadly, even among Christendom today, what people look at is they look at the world around them, or they look at people around them, and somehow begin to think, their marriage is so much better, or their, situation is so much better. And they begin to compare, which ultimately is telling God, you really don't know what you're doing. I think you made a mistake. I think somewhere along the line you missed it. No. It is only when we think that God brought us together as husband and wife, as man and woman together in the covenant of marriage for our own happiness is when we misunderstand God's plan. We have to realize that God placed our spouse in our life for whatever length of period of time He chose to do it for His glory and to make us more holy and blameless. To remove the spot and wrinkle, external and internal contamination. Only then we will be satisfied in God's design and God's plan. But also remember, before I close, marriage also is temporary. What do I mean by that? It is only in this world. It seems an older couple were having this conversation. They were going, and the wife came home really distraught. She went to a meeting and then she came back and says, honey, I just heard that in heaven there is no marriage. And her husband looked at her and said, honey, that's why it's called heaven. It's for this world, where God puts two sinful individuals together in order to make them more like Jesus Christ. And that is why, although the worldly marriages may look fun, they may look like they're having a great time, guess what? If they don't know Jesus Christ, they are going to suffer eternity in hell. God has no plan for them to make them holy. And that's what the scripture says. He wants us. That is why in 1 Peter 2:16, be ye holy for I am holy. God is more interested in making you holy. So everything God allows you to go through in the context of marriage is to what? To do what? To show our own imperfection, to show His perfection and perfect plan, so that you and your spouse together are preparing each other to be more like Christ. It is only when we look at marriage that way. That's God's design, just like He did Adam and Eve. He created both of them for each other, different from each other. So both of them together can be seen as a unit to fulfill God's purpose. So before I close, there's a story about a man who was wandering out in the field. And, this man was deeply in love with his wife, and he was thinking to himself how fortunate he was to have her. So he looked up to heaven and said, God, why did you make her so kind-hearted? God responded, so you could love her, my son. Then he asked, then why did you also make her so good-looking? So you could love her, my son. Why did you make her such a good cook? The man asked. God responded, so you could love her, my son. The man thought about this for a minute, and then he said, I don't want to seem ungrateful, God, or anything. But then why did you make her so dumb? God said, so she could love you, my son. We can laugh at it. But guys that have been married, we are called to be husbands with our what? Example as our Lord Jesus Christ. Sacrificial. What is number 2? Abby, what's the second one? What? Sanctifying. Thirdly? What? Sensitive. Fourthly? What? Satisfying. And fifthly? Specific. Because God's design for marriage is what? One man, one woman for? So that we'll be more like Christ. And God willing, next week, we'll deal with the wife's side of the equation. Because, like I said, God created both equal. Right? But, just like in any organization, because the marriage is what? It is a unit placed under the authority of God. Just like when you go to your office, what? There has to be one boss, right? Otherwise, what happens? Confusion. You don't know where the direction is coming from. Yeah, I had a friend in India. His deal was this. He says, he was a Christian, and his parents also were good Christians. But he says, you know what? In my house, my dad is the head of the house, but my mom is the neck. She turns it whichever way she wants to. And so sometimes the world misuses the authority or the order that God has placed. So next week we will see whether wives are the neck or how God's order is in the. And so, as God, again this month the US is also celebrating the Father's Day, right? Again, it's for all men, and boys, you guys too, teenagers. That's the kind of men you want to be when you grow up. And young girls, that's the kind of man you want to ask God for in your own lives. Why? Because ultimately, when you are married, you want to have someone who will push you more towards Christ. Which will not be easy. Because God knows exactly. God has an incredible sense of humor. As somebody did a survey, and they said 95% of married couples said if they had a choice, they would have never married that person. You know why? Interestingly, because from a human evaluation, it doesn't seem right. But God takes two exactly opposite individuals, puts them together and says, have fun. Why? Because it's His goal to make us like His Son. And in that process of sanctification, He drives us to Him, dependent on Him, looking towards Him. And so husbands, we cannot love our wives like Christ loved the church unless we have been filled with the Spirit of God. It is only when we are filled with the Spirit of God, when we walk in light, when we walk in love, we can walk as God would require us. Because when we stand before Christ one day, although the marriage relationships and all human relationships are going to be erased, God is still going to hold you and me accountable, men as husbands, for how we have led our wives into being sanctified as God would call them to be. So let us just take a couple of minutes to ponder these truths in our own hearts, and then we will close with the word of prayer. Just take a couple of minutes. Again, husbands, to think about, is this the kind of family that I lead? And wives too, to think about, how am I cooperating in this journey to become more like Christ? My holiness. And giving an opportunity for the Lord to do His work, even in the marriage relationship. Because that's God's plan. He says, unless we surrender to His plan, whatever we do outside of what the Scripture says is not going to be blessed by God.